Granny Edna had controlled our family for 3 generations with her twisted breeding philosophy. She lived in the main house and monitored every aspect of our lives, especially the males. Dad had gotten a girl pregnant at 13, just like Grandpa, and Granny Edna constantly reminded us that this tradition was what made our family special and strong. She homeschooled all the boys to prevent us from being contaminated by modern ideas about men's roles, and believed that formal education was specifically designed to destroy men's natural instincts for providing and protecting through reproduction. On my 12th birthday, Granny explained that childhood was officially over, and I would now begin my real purpose as a man. She had already selected 3 girls from neighboring families, and expected me to choose one immediately so we could begin trying for a baby. She said, waiting until adulthood is the poison that makes men think they're too good to fulfill their biological destiny. She gave me exactly 6 months to get one of them pregnant, or she would arrange the situation herself. I was horrified and refused any part of her insane plan, which made Granny Edna absolutely furious. She locked me in my room and began bringing the selected girls to the house for courtship visits, where she would force me to sit with them while she discussed my breeding potential like I was livestock. I would sit there silent and glaring while she explained to these teenage girls that I was prime for fatherhood and that whoever got pregnant by me first would receive a substantial cash reward from opportunities. She removed all books from my room except parenting manuals and male responsibility guides and began feeding me special foods that she claimed would increase my virility. When I still refused to cooperate with her breeding program, she threatened to have me physically restrained during visits with the girls and force the situation herself. They'll know what to do, she said with a twisted smile. I overheard her telling one of the girls' mothers that if I wouldn't cooperate voluntarily, she would drug my food and lock me in a room with whichever girl was most willing. Nature will take its course, she said. Boys that age can't control themselves anyway. When I confronted her, she just smiled and said, one way or another, there will be babies. I couldn't let Granny Edna destroy my life and potentially make me assault someone, so I decided to use her own system against her. I started pretending to be interested in one of the girls, the youngest one named Iris, who seemed the most uncomfortable with the whole arrangement. During our next supervised visit, I managed to pull Iris aside and told her that all of this was against my will. I watched her face go white with horror as I explained that Granny was planning to force both of us into a situation neither of us wanted. Iris was disgusted and agreed to help me escape by pretending to go along with the plan while actually helping me get away. For 2 weeks, we pretended I was warming up to her while she secretly brought me supplies and information about Granny Edna's timeline. I felt hope for the first time in months, knowing I'd found an ally who was just as horrified by the situation as I would. She screamed at me that I had corrupted an innocent girl with modern feminist poison and that she would make sure I fulfilled my purpose that night, even if she had to force it herself. She had prepared what she called natural supplements and was ready to assault both Iris and me to force a pregnancy through whatever means necessary. She said, your little girlfriend is going to carry your child whether either of you likes it or not. But Iris managed to escape from the basement and came bursting into my room. In the chaos of her trying to stop Granny, my grandmother accidentally pressed her medical alert button and emergency services heard everything over the open line. The dispatcher heard her screaming, I don't care if you're children. You're old enough to breed and that's what you're going to do. Followed by the sounds of Iris and me fighting back and crying for help. Police arrived within minutes to find her still trying to restrain me while shouting, this is what boys are for, making the next generation. The officers were horrified and immediately arrested her. I'm 17 now and have no contact with my entire family. I'm relieved to be free, but I don't know if I'll ever be able to have a family of my own because just thinking about relationships makes me completely shut down. The months that followed Granny Edna's arrest were a blur of social workers, court hearings, and temporary placements. I'd been moved to a group home 3 hours away from everything I'd ever known, which was both terrifying and liberating. The other boys in the home had their own horror stories, but somehow mine seemed to make them uncomfortable in a way that surprised me. Even kids who'd been my Uncle Marcus and Aunt Diane, but the state had denied their requests due to their connection to Granny Edna's breeding philosophy. Apparently, Child Services had discovered that the entire extended family was complicit in what they were calling systematic child abuse with intent to commit sexual assault. Your cousin Tyler is in a facility in another county, Janet told me during one of our sessions. He's 3 years older than you and went through something similar when he turned 12. He's been asking to speak with you, but we want to make sure you're ready for that conversation. I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready for much of anything. The group home was okay, better than being tied to a bed, certainly, but I felt like I was floating through life without any anchor. My roommate was a kid named Carlos, who'd been removed from his home after his stepfather had beaten him with a baseball bat. Carlos was tough in a way I wasn't, street smart and quick with comebacks, but he never made me feel weak for being messed up about what I'd been through. Your granny sounds like she was completely psycho, Carlos said one night as we lay in our respective beds, staring at the ceiling. Like serial killer level crazy. Yeah, I said quietly. The worst part is that everyone acted like it was normal. My dad, my uncles, even my mom, they all went along with it because that's how they were raised. What happened to your parents? Carlos asked. That was the question that kept me awake at night. Dad had been arrested as an accessory, though his charges were lighter since he'd been a victim of the same system when he was young. Mom had been placed in a psychiatric facility for evaluation. Back in my life anyway. How do you forgive people for almost letting you get? I couldn't finish the sentence. You don't have to forgive anybody, Carlos said firmly. That's some therapist bullshit. Some things are unforgivable. School was another challenge entirely. Janet had enrolled me in the local high school, and while my academic skills were surprisingly strong thanks to Granny's rigorous homeschooling, my social skills were non-existent. I'd never been around kids my age in a normal setting, never had to navigate the complex social hierarchies that seem to govern teenage life. My first day was a disaster. I sat alone at lunch, unsure how to join conversations or even where to look when kids were talking. A group of girls at a nearby table kept glancing at me and whispering, and I felt my chest tighten with panic. Were they talking about breeding potential? Did they know about my family situation? I ran to the bathroom and threw up, then spent the rest of lunch period hiding in a stall. My English teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, seemed to understand that I was struggling. After class one day, he asked me to stay behind. You're clearly intelligent, he said, organizing papers on his desk. Your essay on Macbeth showed real insight, but you seem isolated. Are you adjusting okay to being here? I shrugged, not sure how to explain that I'd never been allowed to interact with people my age without supervision, that every conversation felt like a minefield, where I might accidentally reveal something that would make people look at me differently. There's a writing club that meets after school on Wednesdays. Mr. Rodriguez continued. Small group, mostly express things that are hard to say out loud. That Wednesday, I found myself standing outside the classroom where writing club met, my hand on the doorknob, heart pounding. Through the small window in the door, I could see about 6 kids sitting in a circle. They looked normal, not the popular kids who scared me, but not the obviously troubled ones either. Just regular teenagers who maybe felt as lost as I did. I opened the door. You must be the new guy, said a girl with short black hair and paint-stained fingers. I'm Maya. Rodriguez said you might join us. The other kids introduced themselves. There was James, who was tall and thin with thick glasses. Sarah, who had scars on her arms that she didn't try to hide. Marcus, not my uncle, thank God, who spoke with a slight lisp, and twins named Alex and Sam who finished each other's sentences. They all looked at me with curiosity but not judgment, and for the first time in months, I felt like maybe I could breathe. breathe. We usually start by sharing something we wrote this week, Maya explained. But if you're not ready, you can just listen. I listened that first day, and the next week, and the week after that. I heard James read a poem about feeling invisible, Sarah share a story about her struggles with self-harm, and Maya describe a painting she was working on that represented her anxiety as a storm cloud that followed her everywhere. These kids were dealing with real problems, but they weren't trying to one-up each other or compete over who had it worse. They just listened and supported each other. After a month of attending, I finally worked up the courage to share something I'd written. It wasn't about my family or Granny Edna. I wasn't ready for that, but means something completely different. I watch people interact and try to decode the patterns, but I always seem to get it wrong. When I finished reading, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Sarah spoke up. That's exactly how I felt when I came back to school after being hospitalized, she said softly. Like everyone could see that I was broken, and I was just pretending to be normal. I still feel like that sometimes, Alex added. Like I'm performing being a teenager instead of actually being one. Their responses made something tight in my chest loosen just a little. Maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. As winter turned to spring, I started to find my footing at school. I still ate lunch alone most days, but I'd found a spot in the library where I could read without feeling exposed. I joined the cross-country team at Mr. Rodriguez's suggestion, discovering that I actually enjoyed the mindless repetition of running and the way it quieted my racing thoughts. My teammates weren't close friends, but they accepted me as the quiet guy who showed up to practice and didn't cause drama. The hardest part was dealing with questions about my family. Most kids didn't pry too deeply when I said I lived in a group home, but occasionally someone would ask follow-up questions that made me panic. I developed a standard response. My family had some problems, so I'm staying somewhere else for a while. It wasn't exactly a lie, and it usually shut down further inquiries, but there were moments when I felt the weight of what had happened crushing down on me. Late at night, I'd lie awake thinking about Iris and wondering what had happened to her. Had her family blamed her for helping me escape? Was she okay? Then someone who understood what it was like to grow up in our family's twisted system, but another part of me was terrified of what he might tell me. What if he'd been broken by it in ways that I was only beginning to understand? One day in late April, Janet came to see me with news that changed everything. Your grandmother's case is finally going to trial, she said, settling into the uncomfortable plastic chair across from my bed in the group home. The prosecutor wants to know if you'd be willing to testify. My stomach dropped. Testify? In front of people? In front of a jury? Yes. And your grandmother would be there, along with her lawyer. I know it's scary to think about, but your testimony could be crucial in making sure she can't hurt any other children. What about my parents? Would they be there? Janet's expression grew careful. Your father is cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. Your mother, she's still not well enough to stand trial. The doctors think she may have been suffering from a dissociative disorder brought on by years of psychological abuse. So she really didn't know what was happening? I asked, not sure if I wanted the answer to be yes or no. It's complicated, Janet said gently. The human mind has ways of protecting itself from trauma, sometimes by forgetting or minimizing things that are too painful to accept. Your mother may have genuinely convinced herself that what was happening was normal and right because the alternative, accepting that she was allowing her son to be abused, was too devastating to face. I spent the next several days thinking about whether I could handle testifying. The writing club kids were incredibly supportive when I finally told them what up. But what if I freeze up there? What if I can't get the words out? Then you try again, James said quietly. And if you can't, then at least you tried. But I think you're stronger than you know. Sarah nodded in agreement. You survived something that would have destroyed a lot of people. Speaking about it in court isn't going to be easy, but you've already done the hard part by surviving it in the first place. I decided to testify. The trial preparation was intense. The prosecutor, a stern woman named District Attorney Chen, met with me several times to go over my testimony. She explained that Granny Edna's lawyer would try to discredit me, possibly by claiming I was a troubled kid who was making up stories for attention, or that I had misunderstood innocent family traditions. Just tell the truth, DA Chen advised. Don't embellish. Don't try to make it more dramatic than it was. The facts of what happened to you are compelling enough on their own. She also warned me that there might be media attention, since cases involving systematic family abuse were relatively rare and sensational. We're going to try to keep your identity protected since you're a minor, but there may be reporters outside the courthouse. Don't talk to them. Don't look at cameras. Just get inside as quickly as possible. The night before I was scheduled to testify, I barely slept. Carlos tried to distract me with video games and stupid jokes, but my mind kept racing through all the things that could go wrong. What if I forgot important details? What if Granny Edna's lawyer made me look like a liar? What if seeing her again made me fall apart completely? Janet picked me up early that morning and drove me to sit with me during my testimony. Remember, DA Chen said, just answer the questions I ask you. Don't volunteer extra information unless I specifically ask for it. If you need a break, just let me know. And don't look at your grandmother unless I ask you to identify her. Keep your eyes on me or the jury. When it was time, Robert walked with me into the courtroom. It was smaller than I'd expected from TV shows, but still intimidating. The jury box was full of adults who all turned to look at me as I walked to the witness stand. I could feel Granny Edna's presence somewhere behind me, but I kept my eyes forward as instructed. DA Chen approached the witness stand after I'd been sworn in. Please state your name for the record, she began. My name is Michael Chen, I said, my voice sounding strange and thin in the formal space. Michael, how old are you? I'm 17. And what is your relationship to the defendant, Edna Morrison? I finally looked over at Granny Edna, sitting at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit. She looked smaller than I remembered, older and frailer, but her eyes still held that same cold intensity that had terrified me as a child. She was staring directly at me with an expression that somehow managed to be both furious and disappointed. She's my paternal grandmother, I said, looking away quickly. DA Chen walked me through my childhood in the Morrison family compound, the homeschooling, the isolation from outside influences. She asked about the family's beliefs about early reproduction and the pressure that had been placed on the men in previous generations. Can you tell the jury what happened on your 12th birthday? She asked. Action to your grandmother's demands, DA Chen continued. I was horrified, I said, my voice growing stronger. I was 12 years old. The idea of having sex with someone, let alone getting them pregnant, was terrifying. I told her no. How did the defendant respond to your refusal? I described the escalating punishments, being locked in my room, the forced courtship visits, the monitoring of my every movement. Several jury members looked disturbed as I explained how Granny Edna had discussed my breeding potential with the selected girls and their families. Did the defendant ever threaten you with physical force? Yes. She said if I wouldn't cooperate voluntarily, she would have me restrained and make it happen anyway. She said she would drug my food so I couldn't fight back. One of the jurors, a middle-aged man with a beard, looked like he was going to be sick. DA Chen asked me to describe the events leading up to my escape attempt with Iris, and then the final night when Granny Edna had drugged my food and tied me to the bed. My voice was shaking by the time I got to the part about the medical alert button and the police arriving. Thank you, Michael, DA Chen said when I finished. No further questions. Granny Edna's lawyer, a thin man with an expensive suit, approached for cross-examination. I'd been dreading this part. Michael, he began in a friendly tone that immediately put me on guard. You've painted a very disturbing picture of your family life, but isn't it true that you've been diagnosed with several psychological disorders since being placed in state custody? DA Chen objected before I could answer, and there was a brief argument between the lawyer. You didn't understand? No, I said firmly. Threatening to drug and rape a 12-year-old isn't a cultural practice. It's a crime. The lawyer looked annoyed that his attempt to confuse me had backfired. He tried several more approaches approaches, suggesting that I was making up details for attention, implying that I had misunderstood innocent comments, questioning whether my memory could be trusted given the trauma I claimed to have experienced. But with each question, I felt more confident rather than less. These weren't gray areas or misunderstandings. What had happened to me was clearly wrong, and no amount of legal maneuvering was going to change that. When the cross-examination was finally over, I felt drained but relieved. Robert walked me back to the waiting room where Janet was ready with a sandwich and a bottle of water. "You did great," she said, squeezing my shoulder. "That was really brave." The trial continued for another week, with testimony from Iris, several other family members, and expert witnesses who explained the psychological dynamics of family-based abuse systems. I didn't attend most of it. DHN thought it would be too stressful, but Janet kept me updated on the major developments. The most shocking testimony came from my cousin Tyler, who had finally been deemed psychologically stable enough to testify. According to Janet, he described going through an identical situation at age 12, including being drugged and physically restrained. He'd eventually been rescued when a teacher had noticed unexplained injuries and reported them to child services, but not before he'd been severely traumatized. He's been in and out of psychiatry to the courthouse to hear it read. Granny Edna was found guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit child sexual abuse, endangerment of a minor, false imprisonment, and several other charges I didn't fully understand. The judge sentenced her to 25 years in prison. As the sentence was read, I watched Granny Edna's face remain completely impassive. She didn't cry or show any sign of remorse. Even as they led her away in handcuffs, she looked back at me with that same cold disappointment, as if I was the one who had failed by not going along with her twisted plan. Outside the courthouse, DHN thanked me again for my testimony. "Cases like this are why I do this job," she said. "You may have saved other children from going through what you experienced." I wanted to feel triumphant, but mostly I just felt tired. The trial was over, but I still had to figure out how to build a life for myself. At 17, I was too old for most adoptive families, which meant I'd likely age out of the foster system in a year, with no family support system to fall back on. But there was also something liberating about that prospect. For the first time in my life, I got to decide what came next. The summer after the trial, I worked at a local pizza place to save money for college. My grades were good enough to qualify for several scholarships, and Janet had helped me apply to schools with strong support programs for former foster kids. I'd been accepted to a state university about 4 hours away, far enough to feel independent, close enough that I could still see my therapist and maintain the few positive relationships I had with one of the members, a girl named Amy, who wrote beautiful, melancholy poetry and understood what it felt like to carry invisible scars. Amy knew the basics of my story, though I hadn't told her all the details. She never pushed for more information than I was ready to share, which made her feel safe in a way I hadn't experienced with anyone else. Our relationship was slow and careful, built on trust rather than passion, which was exactly what I needed. One afternoon in August, Janet came to see me with an unexpected piece of news. "Iris has been asking to see you," she said. "She's doing well. She's in therapy and living with an aunt in another state, but she says she can't move forward without talking to you about what happened." My heart started racing. I'd thought about Iris constantly over the past year, wondering if she blamed me for getting her involved, if she was okay, if she even remembered me clearly. The idea of seeing her again was both thrilling and terrifying. "What would we even say to each other?" I asked. "I don't know," Janet admitted, "but she seems to think it's important. You can take time to think about it." I didn't need time. "Yes," I said immediately. "I want to see her." Janet arranged for us to meet at a neutral location, a coffee shop in a town halfway between where we were both living. I was nervous for days leading up to the meeting, unsure what to expect. Would she look different? Would the shared trauma have changed her in ways that were visible? Would we have anything to say to each other beyond apologizing? But when I saw Iris walk into the coffee shop, she looked almost exactly as I remembered. Maybe a little taller, her hair longer, but still the same girl who had risked her safety to help me for a moment before she spoke again. "I've been wanting to talk to you for so long, to make sure you're okay, but also to say thank you." "Thank you? I should be thanking you. You saved my life." Iris shook her head. "You saved both our lives by telling me what was really happening." Before that conversation, I thought I was just supposed to go along with whatever the adults decided. I didn't even realize I had a choice. We talked for almost 3 hours, sharing what had happened to each of us since that night. Iris had been placed with her mother's sister, who had cut off all contact with the families involved in Granny Edna's scheme. She was doing well in school, had made friends, and was planning to study psychology in college. "I want to help other kids who've been through stuff like this," she said. "Not as a therapist necessarily, but maybe as an advocate or working for child services. I feel like I understand things that people who grew up in normal families might miss." We exchanged contact information and promised to stay in touch. As we prepared to leave, Iris reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I'm really glad you're okay," she said, "and I'm proud of us for getting out." "Me too," I said, and for the first time, I really meant it. As my senior year of high school began, I felt more stable than I had since childhood. I had a plan for the future, people who cared about me, and most importantly, a sense that I could trust my own judgment about what was right and wrong. The nightmares still came sometimes, and there were days when the weight of what had happened felt overwhelming, but I was learning to manage those feelings rather than being controlled. One of them had been accepted for publication in a journal focused on young adult voices. The piece was about feeling like an alien learning human customs, but anyone who read it carefully could see the deeper themes about growing up outside normal society and the challenge of integrating after trauma. Seeing my words in print felt like a small victory, proof that something good could come from even the worst experiences. College acceptance letters started arriving in the spring. I'd been accepted to 3 schools, but my first choice was still the state university, where I'd been offered a full scholarship through their program for students aging out of foster care. The scholarship would cover not just tuition and room and board, but also provide a stipend for books and personal expenses, plus access to counseling services and academic support. At the scholarship reception, I met other students who'd been through the foster system. Their stories were all different from mine. Some had been removed from homes due to neglect, others because of addiction or mental illness in their families, others because of physical abuse. But we all shared a certain resilience and independence that came from having to grow up too fast. "The weird thing," said a girl named Samantha who'd aged out of care 2 years earlier, "is that in some ways, we're more prepared for college than kids who've had everything handed to them. We know how to take care of ourselves, how to manage money, how to ask for help when we need it." She was right. While my high school classmates seemed anxious about being away from home for the first time, I was excited about the freedom to make my own choices without anyone to receive my diploma. I felt proud rather than sad about my circumstances. The people who were there had chosen to support me, which felt more meaningful than having people there out of obligation. That summer, I worked full-time to save money for college expenses not covered by the scholarship. Amy and I had decided to maintain our relationship despite going to different schools. She'd be attending an art school about 6 hours away, but we both acknowledged that we were young and our lives were about to change dramatically. "I think we should see what happens naturally rather than making promises we might not be able to keep," she said one evening as we sat by the lake near town. "But I want you to know that you've been really important to me this year. You helped me believe that it's possible to trust people again." I felt the same way about her, but I also knew she was right about not making promises. We were both healing from different kinds of trauma, and we needed space to figure out who we were as individuals before we could fully commit to someone else. A few days before I left for college, I received an unexpected letter from Tyler. Janet had given him my address with my permission, mistaken, and he'd been waiting for the right moment to reach out. Dear Michael, the letter began. I hope you don't mind me writing to you. I've been wanting to contact you since the trial, but I needed to get my head together first. I wanted you to know how proud I am of you for having the courage to testify. I know how hard that must have been. I'm doing better now than I have in years. I'm living in a group home for older teenagers, working part-time, and planning to start community college in the spring. My therapist says that healing myself for not being strong enough to stop it, for not protecting you and the other younger cousins. My therapist helped me understand that we were children in an impossible situation, and we did the best we could with what we had. I also wanted you to know that there are other family members who are horrified by what happened and want to make things right. Our cousin Sarah, Uncle Mark's daughter, reached out to me through a social worker. She's older, she was already married and out of the house when we were growing up, and she says she had no idea what was happening to the younger generation. She's been asking about both of us and wants to know if we'd be open to contact at some point. I'm not ready for that yet, but it made me feel less alone to know that not everyone in our family is crazy. Maybe someday we can build relationships with the relatives who actually deserve to be called family. Anyway, I hope college goes well for you. You deserve every good thing that comes your way. Stay strong, and remember that surviving what we survived makes us tougher than most people will ever need to be. Your cousin, Tyler. Reading Tyler's letter made me cry, not from sadness, but from relief. For years, I'd felt like I was the only one who understood what our family had been like, the only one carrying the weight of those memories. Knowing that Tyler was not only surviving but thriving gave me hope that healing was really possible. I wrote back to him that same day, sharing details about my college plans and my own therapy progress. I also told him about Iris and how reconnecting with her had helped me feel less alone. We agreed to stay in touch and maybe meet in person once we were both off. Childhood toys, photo albums, furniture from their bedrooms, clothes in every size they'd ever worn. My life could be reduced to some books, a few changes of clothes, and my laptop. But instead of feeling sorry for myself, I felt free. I wasn't carrying the weight of family expectations or childhood memories tied to physical objects. I could become whoever I wanted to be without the constant reminder of who I'd been forced to be. Carlos called that evening to wish me luck. You're going to do great, he said. You're the smartest person I know, and you've already survived worse things than college. What about you? How are things with your uncle? Good, actually, really good. He's helping me look at colleges for next year. Turns out I'm pretty good at math when I'm not worried about getting beaten for wrong answers. We'd both learned that we were more capable than our circumstances had allowed us to be. It was a good feeling. Janet drove me to campus on a sunny Saturday in August. The university was huge, over 30,000 students, which had intimidated me when I'd visited, but now felt exciting. I could disappear into the crowd when I wanted to, but there were also dozens of clubs and organizations where I could find my people. My dorm room was small but private, since the scholarship program had arranged for me to have a single room to help with the adjustment. My roommate would have been randomly assigned, and the program coordinators thought it would be better for me to have space to decompress without having to navigate the complexities of living with a stranger. As Janet helped me move my things in, I felt a moment of panic. This was really happening. I was on my own, responsible for that smelled like industrial carpet and cleaning supplies, surrounded by the sounds of other families moving their kids in, parents giving last-minute advice, siblings complaining about having to carry heavy boxes, friends promising to visit soon. That first night, I called Amy to tell her arrived safely. How does it feel? She asked. Scary, I admitted, but good scary. Like standing at the edge of a cliff before jumping into water. Terrifying, but exciting. That's exactly how I feel too. I think we picked the right schools. Classes started the following Monday. My schedule was carefully planned. Introduction to psychology, English composition, college algebra, world history, and a first-year seminar specifically for scholarship recipients that would help us navigate campus resources and academic expectations. The psychology class immediately captured my interest. Professor Williams was a middle-aged woman who had studied trauma and resilience, and her lectures often touched on topics that felt personally relevant. During the second week, she assigned us to write a brief personal reflection on what had motivated us to study psychology. I wrote about growing up in an unusual family situation that had given me first-hand experience with manipulation, control, and the ways people could be taught to accept abnormal circumstances as normal. I mentioned that I was interested in understanding how some people survived trauma while others were destroyed by it, and how society could better protect vulnerable children. Professor Williams asked me to stay after class. That intrigued me. What would that involve? Well, you'd need to continue on to graduate school eventually, but there are opportunities for undergraduates to assist with ongoing studies. I'm currently working on a project examining resilience factors in survivors of family-based abuse. If you're interested, you could start as a research assistant and see if the work appeals to you. I said yes immediately. Working in Professor Williams' lab became the highlight of my week. I helped code survey responses, transcribe interviews, and organize data. But more importantly, I got to read the stories of other survivors and see patterns in how people had rebuilt their lives after traumatic childhoods. Many of the participants had struggled with the same issues I was facing: difficulty trusting others, challenges with intimate relationships, and a persistent feeling of being different from people who'd had normal upbringings. But they'd also developed strengths that served them well: independence, empathy, resilience, and a deep appreciation for genuine kindness from others. One thing we're finding consistently, Professor Williams told me during one of our research meetings, is that survivors who are able to find meaning in their experiences tend to have better long-term outcomes. Not that they're grateful for the trauma, but they're able to use what they learn to help others or to appreciate aspects of life that others take for granted. That conversation stuck with me. I'd already started to see how my experiences had shaped me in positive ways. I was more independent than most of my classmates, more grateful for small kindnesses, more aware of red flags developing. I joined the campus writing group and the psychology club. I'd even started dating casually, though nothing serious. I wasn't ready for a committed relationship, but I was learning how to interact with people my age without the constant anxiety that had plagued me in high school. Tyler and I had been exchanging letters regularly, and he'd started community college as planned. His letters were increasingly optimistic, full of details about classes he was enjoying and new friendships he was building. He'd also reconnected with our cousin Sarah, who had turned out to be everything he'd hoped, horrified by our family's history and determined to be a source of support for the younger generation. Sarah wants to meet you, Tyler wrote in one letter. She's been asking about you since the trial. I told her you were doing well in college, and she said she'd be honored to know you if you're ever ready for that. No pressure, but I thought you should know the option is there. I wasn't ready yet, but I appreciated knowing that not every family connection was toxic. Maybe someday I'd be strong enough to explore relationships with the relatives who genuinely cared about my well-being. Spring semester brought new challenges and opportunities. I declared psychology as my major and added a minor in creative writing. Professor Williams had invited me to co-author a paper based on the research I'd been helping with, which would be my first academic publication. And I'd been selected for a competitive summer internship at a residential treatment facility for adolescents who'd experienced trauma. The internship was both rewarding and emotionally difficult. Working with teenagers who'd been abused, neglected, I also saw incredible resilience. Kids who'd been through hell but still had hope for the future. Young people who'd learned to trust adults again despite having every reason to be suspicious. Teenagers who were determined to break the cycles of abuse in their families and create better lives for themselves. One of the residents, a 15-year-old named David, reminded me of myself at that age. He'd been removed from a religious cult that that had isolated children and subjected them to physical and psychological abuse. Like me, he struggled with feeling different from kids who'd had normal childhoods, and he had difficulty trusting authority figures despite intellectually understanding that not all adults were dangerous. The hardest part, David told me during one of our conversations, is that I don't know how to tell which things I learned are normal and which are messed up. Like, I still have this voice in my head telling me that I'm selfish for wanting things for myself instead of just serving the group. I understood exactly what he meant. Even after years of therapy and education about healthy relationships, I still sometimes caught myself thinking in patterns that had been programmed into me during childhood. The difference was that now I could recognize those thoughts and choose whether to listen to them. It gets easier, I told David. Not easy, but easier. The voice doesn't go away completely, but you learn to talk back to it. Working with the residents at the treatment facility confirmed my career path. I wanted to specialize in helping young people who'd survived family-based trauma, particularly the kind of systematic abuse that happened in closed communities or isolated. The following year, my relationship with Amy had evolved into a close friendship. We'd both grown and changed too much to maintain a romantic relationship, but we stayed in touch and visited each other a few times a year. I'd also finally felt ready to meet cousin Sarah. Tyler arranged for the three of us to get together during spring break at a restaurant in a neutral city. Sarah was in her early 30s, married with 2 young children, and worked as a social worker. She hugged both Tyler and me when we met, and I was surprised by how natural it felt. "I've been carrying guilt about what happened to you boys for years," she said over dinner. I knew Granny Edna was controlling and had strange ideas, but I had no idea she was planning to force children into sexual situations. If I'd known, I would have called the police myself. Sarah shared stories about our family that helped fill in gaps in my understanding. She explained that Granny Edna's obsession with early reproduction had started after she'd lost several babies in infancy and become convinced that older mothers produced weaker children. Over the years, her beliefs had become more extreme, and she'd become more isolated from family members who questioned her methods. "Your father and uncles were victims too," Sarah said. "They were raised to believe that questioning Granny Edna was a betrayal of family loyalty. That doesn't excuse what they allowed to happen to you, but it helps explain why they couldn't see how wrong it was." Meeting Sarah felt like reclaiming a piece of healthy family connection. She invited both Tyler and me to visit her family sometime, and I found myself actually considering and provided a space for students to share their experiences and strategies for managing the unique challenges that came with having unstable or abusive family backgrounds. The support group had grown to include about 15 regular members, and their stories reminded me of how diverse family trauma could be. There was Maria, whose parents had been deported when she was 16, leaving her to finish high school while living with friends. James had been raised in a family where emotional abuse was the norm, and he struggled with self-worth and perfectionism. Ashley had grown up with an alcoholic mother and had learned to parent her younger siblings while barely being a child herself. Despite our different experiences, we found common ground in the challenges we faced: difficulty trusting others, a tendency to be hyper-vigilant about potential threats, struggles with feeling worthy of love and support, and the challenge of building adult relationships without healthy family models to guide us. "The thing that's helped me most," I told the group during one meeting, "is realizing that healing isn't about forgetting what happened or forgiving people who don't deserve it. It's about taking back control of your own story and deciding who you want to become." Professor Williams had become more of a mentor than just a research supervisor. She'd connected me with graduate programs that would be good fits for my interests and had encouraged me to present our research at national conferences. Standing in front of rooms full of psychology professionals and sharing findings about resilience in trauma survivors felt like the culmination of everything before it became abusive. As senior year approached, I felt ready for the next phase of my life. I'd been accepted to several graduate programs and had chosen to attend a university known for its clinical psychology program and its research on family systems. My goal was to earn a PhD and eventually work as both a therapist and researcher, splitting my time between treating individual clients and conducting studies that could inform better practices for helping survivors. Tyler had also thrived during his time in community college and had been accepted to transfer to a 4-year university as a social work major. He planned to work in child protection services, helping to identify and investigate cases of family abuse. We both found ways to transform our experiences into tools for helping others. During my final semester of college, I received an unexpected letter from Iris. We'd stayed in touch sporadically over the years, but this letter felt different, more urgent and personal. "Dear Michael," she wrote, "I hope you're doing well and that your senior year is going smoothly. I have some news that I wanted to share with you personally before you might hear it through other channels. I've been accepted to law school and plan to specialize in family law and child advocacy. My goal is to work with children who are involved in custody cases or who need legal representation in abuse situations. I know it sounds cliche, but our experience really did shape my career path in a fundamental way. But that's not the main reason I'm writing. I wanted you first. I think there could be value in sharing our story if it might help other kids recognize that what's happening to them isn't normal, or if it helps adults identify warning signs. But I also understand if you'd rather keep your story private. We've both worked hard to build lives beyond what happened to us, and you shouldn't have to relive it publicly if you don't want to. Let me know what you think. Either way, I'm proud of the person you've become and grateful that we both made it out." The idea of participating in a documentary was simultaneously appealing and terrifying. On one hand, I'd spent years learning about trauma and recovery, and I knew the value of sharing survivor stories to educate others and reduce stigma. On the other hand, my story was intensely personal, and I wasn't sure I wanted it dissected by strangers or used for entertainment. I decided to meet with the filmmaker, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who turned out to be a psychologist herself, who had transitioned to documentary work as a way of bringing attention to underreported social issues. Her previous films had focused on subjects like trafficking survivors and children who'd been raised in extreme religious communities. "I'm not interested in sensationalizing what happened to you, Dr. Walsh explained during our initial meeting. "My goal is to create an educational piece that could be used in training programs for social workers, teachers, law enforcement, people who might encounter children in similar situations." She showed me clips from her previous documentaries, which were thoughtful and respectful while absolutely, this would be your story to tell. I'd be facilitating, not directing the narrative. After several more conversations and meetings with Iris and Tyler, who had also been invited to participate, we agreed to move forward with the project. The documentary would follow the three of us as we completed our educations and began our careers in helping professions, while also including our perspectives on what had happened and how we'd healed. Filming was emotionally challenging but ultimately cathartic. Being able to tell my story in my own words, with context and nuance, felt empowering in a way I hadn't expected. I wasn't just a victim of bizarre family abuse, I was a survivor who had used his experiences to build a meaningful career and help others. The documentary, titled Breaking the Chain: Survivors of Family-Based Abuse, premiered at several film festivals and was eventually picked up by a streaming service. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with particular praise for the way it balanced the horror of what had happened with hope for recovery. More importantly, it generated conversations about how to identify and intervene in cases of systematic family abuse. Several viewers reached out to say that watching the film had helped them recognize similar patterns in their own families or communities, leading them to seek help or report suspected abuse. I graduated magna cum laude with a double major in psychology and creative writing. At the graduation ceremony, Janet sat in the family section along with Tyler, Sarah, Amy, and several friends from the support group I'd started, abusions, and the impact I'd had on campus through my advocacy work. Students like Michael remind us why we do this work, she said. He's taken his personal experiences and transformed them into tools for understanding and helping others. That's the best possible outcome we can hope for from the intersection of personal pain and academic study. That summer, before starting graduate school, I took a trip to Europe with some friends from college, my first real vacation that wasn't planned around family obligations or therapeutic goals. Standing in the Colosseum in Rome, I thought about how far I'd traveled from that 12-year-old boy who'd been tied to a bed by his grandmother. The physical distance was nothing compared to the psychological journey. I'd learned to trust my own judgment, to form healthy relationships, to set boundaries, and to find meaning in even the worst experiences. I'd built a life that was entirely my own, based on my values and choices rather than someone else's twisted philosophy. Graduate school brought new challenges and deeper opportunities to specialize in trauma treatment. My advisor, Dr. Martinez, was a renowned expert in family systems therapy who had agreed to supervise my dissertation research on resilience factors in survivors of systematic abuse. Your perspective as someone who's lived through this type of trauma is invaluable, she told me during our first meeting. But you'll need to learn to balance personal experience with clinical objectivity. That's not always easy, but it's what will make you most effective as both a researcher and a clinician. She was right. Learning to think analytic experience. My first year of graduate school was intense but rewarding. I was taking advanced courses in psychopathology, assessment, and therapeutic techniques, while also beginning to see clients under supervision. My first client was a teenage girl who had been removed from a polygamous religious community, and I was struck by how many similarities there were between her experience and mine. How do you know which thoughts are your own and which are just programming? She asked during one of our sessions. It was the same question David had asked at the treatment facility, the same question I'd struggled with for years. I think the real thoughts are the ones that make you feel more like yourself rather than less, I told her. The programming usually makes you feel smaller, more fearful, more dependent on others for approval. Your own thoughts usually make you feel more capable and more connected to what you actually want and need. Seeing clients who'd survived experiences similar to mine was both challenging and validating. It confirmed that my career choice was right, but it also required me to constantly manage my own emotional responses to their stories. Tyler had graduated from his 4-year program and was working for Child Protective Services in another state. His letters described the difficult but rewarding work of investigating abuse cases and helping children find safe placements. He'd also gotten married to a woman he'd met in his social work program, someone who understood his background and shared his commitment to child welfare. I never thought I'd be able to trust anyone enough to get married, he wrote, but Sarah, not our cousin, relationships during college and graduate school, but I still struggled with the level of vulnerability required for true intimacy. I could share the facts of my story, but letting someone see the ongoing impact it had on me, the nightmares, the moments of panic, the way I sometimes shut down emotionally when I felt overwhelmed, remained difficult. My second year of graduate school, I met someone who changed that. Her name was Dr. Rachel Kim, and she was a postdoctoral researcher in the same lab where I was working on my dissertation. She was studying intergenerational transmission of trauma, how traumatic experiences affected not just the people who lived through them, but their children and grandchildren as well. Rachel had grown up in a family that had fled political persecution in South Korea, and while her childhood had been stable and loving, she'd been shaped by her parents' unprocessed trauma in ways she was only beginning to understand as an adult. I think people who've been touched by trauma, even secondhand, recognize something in each other, she said during one of our early conversations. We understand that healing isn't linear and that strength can coexist with vulnerability. Our relationship developed slowly, built on shared professional interests and mutual respect before becoming romantic. Rachel never pushed me to share more than I was ready to, but she also didn't treat me like I was fragile or broken. She saw me as a complete person whose experiences had made me more empathetic and insightful, not damaged. I'm attracted to your mind, she told me one evening as we worked late in the lab. The way you think about resilience and recovery helped me see my experiences from new angles. It sounds like your grandmother was trying to create a kind of breeding program, she said after I described Granny Edna's philosophy. Like she saw the family as livestock that needed to be managed for optimal reproduction. That's deeply dehumanizing for everyone involved, but especially for the children who were treated as commodities rather than individuals with their own needs and desires. Her clinical perspective helped me understand aspects of my experience that I'd never fully analyzed. It also made me appreciate how far I'd come in terms of intellectual and emotional development. I could discuss the most traumatic parts of my childhood with someone I loved without being overwhelmed by emotion or shame. Rachel and I began collaborating on research projects that combined her expertise in intergenerational trauma with my focus on family-based abuse systems. Our work was published in several peer-reviewed journals and presented at national conferences. We made a good team, both personally and professionally. By my 4th year of graduate school, I was writing my dissertation and seeing clients independently under minimal supervision. My research focused on identifying protective factors that help some children survive systematic family abuse with fewer long-term negative outcomes than others. The findings were consistent with what I'd observed in my own life and in working with other survivors. Strong relationships with at least one caring adult, access to education or information that contradicted abusive messaging, and I had never seen functional relationships modeled, so they needed explicit instruction in things that other people learned through observation during childhood. The approach seemed to be effective with the clients I was treating, and several colleagues had asked me to train them in the techniques I was using. I began offering workshops and continuing education seminars for other therapists, which felt like a natural extension of the advocacy work I'd been doing since college. One of the most rewarding aspects of my clinical work was seeing clients progress from feeling broken and hopeless to recognizing their own strength and resilience. A client named Kevin, who had survived a situation remarkably similar to mine, summed it up perfectly during one of our final sessions. When I first came here, I felt like I was pretending to be a normal person, he said. Like everyone could see that I was damaged and didn't belong in regular society. Now I realize that I am a normal person who happened to grow up in abnormal circumstances. The problem was never me, it was the situation I was in. That shift in perspective, from seeing themselves as fundamentally flawed to understanding that they were normal people who had survived abnormal experiences, was often the turning point in therapy. Once clients made that cognitive shift, they could begin to see their survival skills and resilience as strengths rather than just coping mechanisms. As I prepared to defend my dissertation and finish my graduate training, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. 8 years earlier, I'd been a terrified 17-year-old with no family support, and the practical applications of my findings. Dr. Martinez, my advisor, said it was one of the strongest dissertations she'd seen in her 20-year career. You've managed to conduct objective, methodologically sound research on a topic that's deeply personal to you, she said during the post-defense celebration. That takes exceptional intellectual and emotional maturity. You should be very proud of what you've accomplished. Rachel surprised me with a small party that included Janet, Tyler and his wife, Sarah and her family, Amy Amy, and several friends and colleagues from graduate school. Looking around the room at the people who had supported me through various phases of my journey, I felt overwhelmed with gratitude. I want to make a toast, Tyler said, raising his glass of wine. To my cousin Michael, who had the courage to say no when he was 12 years old, and has spent the last decade proving that surviving trauma can make you stronger, not weaker. You've inspired me, you've inspired other survivors, and you've changed the field of psychology for the better. I'm proud to be your family. The job market for psychology PhDs was competitive, but I was fortunate to receive several offers for postdoctoral fellowships and entry-level faculty positions. I ultimately accepted a position as an assistant professor at a mid-sized university with a strong clinical psychology program and a commitment to community-based research. My new job would involve teaching graduate courses in trauma treatment, supervising doctoral students, conducting research, and maintaining a small personal and professional relationship. We've been talking about marriage, and I was surprised to find that the idea didn't terrify me the way I'd always assumed it would. I used to think I could never get married because I didn't have any models of healthy relationships, I told her one evening as we unpacked boxes in our new apartment. But I realize now that we can create our own model based on what we know about trust, respect, and mutual support. That's actually better than just copying what your parents did, Rachel replied. We get to be intentional about building the kind of relationship we want, rather than just defaulting to what we grew up with. The first year of my faculty position was challenging but exciting. Teaching graduate students about trauma treatment felt like a natural extension of the mentoring I'd been doing throughout graduate school. Many of my students were drawn to the field because of their own personal experiences, and I tried to help them navigate the balance between personal insight and professional objectivity. My research program was getting off the ground, with funding from several federal agencies and foundations interested in child abuse prevention. I was collaborating with colleagues across multiple disciplines: social work, criminology, pediatrics, and education, to develop better ways of identifying and intervening in cases of systematic family abuse. The documentary about Tyler, Iris, and me had continued to have an impact, leading to policy changes in several states regarding how Child Protective Services investigated reports of abuse in isolated or religious. I received emails and letters from people all over the world who had survived similar experiences and found hope in seeing that recovery was possible. One letter, from a young woman in Australia, particularly moved me. Dear Dr. Chen, I saw your documentary and wanted you to know that it probably saved my life. I grew up in a religious community that had many of the same characteristics as your family: isolation, control, inappropriate sexual demands placed on children. I had always assumed that what happened to me was normal, or at least that I was too damaged to ever have a real life. Seeing you and Tyler and Iris thriving in your careers and relationships made me realize that I could build a different kind of life too. I'm starting college next year and planning to study social work. Thank you for having the courage to share your story. Letters like that reminded me why the work was important. Every survivor who found hope, every professional who learned to recognize warning signs, every policy change that made it easier to protect vulnerable children, it all added up to meaningful impact. Rachel and I got married during my second year as a faculty member. The wedding was small, held in Sarah's backyard with just close friends and chosen family members in attendance. Tyler officiated, having been ordained online specifically for the occasion. Janet walked me down the aisle, since she was the person who had most consistently supported and guided me through my transition to adulthood. I'm so proud of the man you've become, she whispered as we walked together. When I first met you, you were so angry and scared. Look at you now. You're helping love and stability, even after experiencing profound betrayal and trauma. 2 years later, Rachel and I welcomed our first child, a daughter we named Hope. Holding her for the first time, I was struck by the fierce protectiveness I felt. Not just the normal parental instinct to keep her safe, but a deep determination to give her the childhood I'd never had. She's going to grow up knowing she has value beyond what she can produce or provide for others, I told Rachel as we sat in the hospital room, taking turns holding our daughter. She'll know that her thoughts and feelings matter, that she has the right to make her own choices about her body and her life, and that love doesn't come with conditions or threats. She's also going to grow up knowing that her father is a survivor who became a healer, Rachel replied. That's going to teach her about resilience and the possibility of transforming pain into purpose. Becoming a parent while maintaining my clinical practice created some interesting challenges. Hearing stories of child abuse was always difficult, but it became almost unbearable now that I had a child of my own. I had to develop new coping strategies and be more careful about managing my caseload to avoid becoming overwhelmed by secondary trauma. But parenthood also deepened my understanding of family dynamics and child development in ways that enhanced my clinical work. I could better appreciate the vulnerability of children and the profound responsibility that parents had to protect and nurture them. I could also better understand how some parents might fail in that responsibility due to their own trauma or mental health, navigating those questions in our own lives. The good news, I told a group of therapists during a continuing education workshop, is that having a traumatic childhood doesn't doom you to repeat those patterns. In fact, survivors often become exceptionally thoughtful and intentional parents because they're so determined not to repeat what they experienced. The key is doing the healing work before having children, so you're parenting from a place of health rather than unresolved trauma. As Hope grew from an infant to a toddler, I found myself marveling at her natural curiosity, her assumption that adults would meet her needs, and her complete lack of fear about expressing her wants and preferences. This was what childhood was supposed to look like, a time of exploration and learning, protected by adults who prioritized the child's well-being above all else. Tyler and his wife had also become parents, and we often talked about the strange experience of raising children when we'd never had healthy childhoods ourselves. Sometimes I panic because I don't know if I'm doing it right, Tyler admitted during one of our phone calls. I don't have a template for what good parenting looks like because I never experienced it. But that's also our strength, I reminded him. We're not parenting on autopilot the way people who had normal childhoods might. We're thinking carefully about every choice, researching child development, and constantly checking in with ourselves and each other. Our kids are going to benefit from that intentionality. My career continued to develop in directions I'd never anticipated. I was promoted to associate professor with tenure. Published a book. Development was the support group I'd started for adult survivors of systematic family abuse. The group met monthly and included people from all different backgrounds, former members of religious cults, survivors of trafficking, people who'd escaped abusive extended families, and others who'd experienced similar types of systematic, family-based trauma. What I love about this group, said Maria, a survivor of a trafficking ring that had been run by her own relatives, is that we understand each other without having to explain everything. We all know what it's like to have the people who were supposed to protect you be the ones who hurt you. We all know what it's like to have to rebuild your understanding of what's normal and what's not. The group had become a kind of chosen family for its members, and several long-term friendships had developed. We celebrated each other's milestones, supported each other through difficult times, and served as living proof that healing and thriving after severe trauma was possible. One evening, as I was putting Hope to bed, she asked me a question that stopped me in my tracks. Daddy, why don't I have grandmas and grandpas like other kids? I'd known this conversation would come eventually, but I still wasn't prepared for it. Hope was only 4, too young for the full truth about my family history, but old enough to notice that she only had grandparents on her mother's side. Well, sweetheart, I said carefully, sometimes families look different. Some kids have lots of grandparents parents, some have a few, and some don't have any. What matters isn't how many family members you have, but how much love you have in your life. Do I have a lot of love? I told Rachel about the conversation. We're going to have to figure out how to talk to her about your family as she gets older, Rachel said. Not the details, obviously, but some version of the truth that helps her understand why that part of her history is missing. I know. I want her to understand that some adults make choices that hurt children, and that when that happens, other adults step in to keep the children safe. I want her to know that she's always protected, but also that she should trust her instincts if something doesn't feel right. She's going to be a strong kid, Rachel said. She's growing up with parents who prioritize her well-being above everything else, and she's learning that families can be built from love and choice, not just biology. As Hope's 5th birthday approached, I found myself thinking about the cycles that had been broken and the new patterns we were creating. Granny Edna had believed that children existed to serve the family's reproductive goals. My parents had been taught to prioritize the family system over their children's individual needs. But Hope was growing up knowing that she was valuable simply for being herself, that her thoughts and feelings mattered, and that the adults in her life were there to support her growth, rather than exploit her for their own purposes. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Where I had been taught that questioning authority was dangerous, Hope was encouraged to ask questions and think critically. Where I had been isolated and controlled, she was given age-appropriate freedom and encouraged to explore her interests. Where I had been told that my value came from what I'd transformed the trajectory of my family line forever. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Tyler. I have some news, he said, his voice tight with an emotion I couldn't identify. Granny Edna died in prison last night. I sat down heavily on the park bench, watching Hope climb on the jungle gym while processing this information. I'd known this call would come eventually. Granny Edna had been in her 70s when she was sentenced, and prison wasn't kind to elderly inmates. But I hadn't expected the complicated mix of emotions I was feeling: relief, sadness, anger, and something that might have been grief. How do you feel about it? Tyler asked. I don't know yet, I admitted. She was a monster, but she was also a human being who'd probably been damaged by her own upbringing. I feel sad for the person she could have been if she'd gotten help for her trauma instead of perpetuating it. I keep thinking about all the children she won't be able to hurt now, Tyler said. Even in prison, she was sending letters to family members, trying to convince them to continue her work. At least that's over now. We talked for a few more minutes about funeral arrangements, neither of us planned to attend, and about how to tell other family members the news. After we hung up, I sat on the park bench watching my daughter play, thinking about the long chain of trauma that had finally been broken. That evening, I called Janet to let her know about Granny Edna's death. How are you processing this? She asked, slipping into her familiar social worker voice. I think I'm okay, I said. It feels like the end of a chapter, you know? She can't hurt anyone else now, and I've built a life that she could never be like Tyler, Iris, and I had found the courage to speak out about what had happened to us. Our documentary, research, advocacy, and clinical work had contributed to better training for professionals, stronger laws protecting children, and increased awareness of the signs of systematic family abuse. But the most important victory was sitting right here in front of me, a little girl who would never question whether she was loved, who would never doubt her right to make choices about her own body and her own life, who would grow up understanding that families should be sources of support rather than control. Daddy, Hope said sleepily, tell me the story about the brave boy who helped other kids. She was referring to a simplified, age-appropriate version of my story that I'd started telling her recently, about a boy who lived with adults who didn't take good care of children, and how he was brave enough to ask for help so that he and other children could be safe. Once upon a time, I began. There was a boy who lived in a place where the adults forgot that children are precious gifts who deserve to be loved and protected. As I told the story, our story, I realized that this was how healing really worked. Not through forgetting or forgiving or moving on, but through transforming our experiences into something that could protect and nurture others. The trauma would always be part of my history, but it was no longer the most important part of my story. The most important part was what came next, the family I'd chosen, the life I'd built, the people I